Millionaire CEO fires his maid for being ugly. But years later, he sees her on TV and can't believe it. Before the story begins, tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel. Help us grow on YouTube. Your support means everything to us. Now, enjoy the story. Crystal chandelier in Marcus Wellington's Upper East Side mansion cast perfect diamonds of light across the Italian marble floors. At 38, Marcus had everything money could buy: a $25 million penthouse overlooking Central Park, a tech empire worth billions, and a reputation as one of Manhattan's most ruthless CEOs. But on this cold February morning, his perfectly manicured world was about to collide with reality. Elena Rodriguez moved quietly through the grand foyer, her worn cleaning supplies creating the only sound in the pristine silence. For 3 years, she had maintained this palace of luxury with the dedication of someone who understood the value of hard work. Every surface gleamed, every flower arrangement was perfect, every detail attended to with care that came from genuine pride in her work. What Marcus didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn, was that Elena held a journalism degree from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. She spoke 3 languages fluently and had once dreamed of reporting from newsrooms in Mexico City. But life had other plans. Her mother's medical bills, her younger brother's education, and the promise of American opportunity had led her to this mansion, where she worked 16-hour days to send money home. "Elena!" Marcus's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. He stood at the top of the marble staircase, his $5,000 suit impeccable, his expression cold. "Come here, now." Elena set down her supplies and climbed the stairs, her heart already sensing trouble. She had worked for wealthy families before. She knew that tone. Marcus waited until she reached the landing, then looked her up and down with undisguised disdain. "I'm having the Blackstone investors over tonight. 20 of the most powerful people in Manhattan, people who control billions in assets." "Yes, sir. Everything will be perfect, as always." "That's the problem." Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "You don't understand what perfect means in my world, do you?" Elena's stomach tightened. "Sir, look at yourself." His eyes swept over her worn uniform, her tired face, her calloused hands. "These people expect a certain aesthetic, a certain standard. When Thomas Blackstone walks into my home, everything he sees reflects on me. The art, the furniture, the staff, everything." The word staff hung in the air like poison. "I've worked for you faithfully for 3 years, Mr. Wellington. I've never given you reason to—" "Reason?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Elena, you're a good worker. I'll give you that, but good enough isn't good enough anymore. My image, my reputation, my business relationships, they all depend on maintaining a certain level of, let's call it, sophistication." Elena felt her world tilting. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your services are no longer required." He pulled out an envelope from his jacket. 2 weeks' pay, more than generous considering. The envelope felt like it weighed nothing in Elena's trembling hands. 3 years of her life, of perfect service, of sacrifice, reduced to a dismissal that lasted 30 seconds. "Mr. Wellington, please. My family depends on this job. I can work different hours, stay out of sight when you have guests." "Elena." His voice carried the final authority of a man who had never been told no. "This isn't a negotiation. Pack your things. I want you gone within the hour." As Elena stood there, something shifted in her eyes. Not anger, something deeper, something that Marcus, in his arrogance, completely missed. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for the opportunity to serve your family, Mr. Wellington. I hope someday you understand what you're losing today." She turned and walked down the marble staircase with her head held high, leaving Marcus alone with his perfect empty mansion and his perfectly cold heart. What Marcus Wellington didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The cramped studio apartment in Queens felt like a different planet compared to the marble halls of Marcus Wellington's mansion. Elena sat on her second-hand couch, staring at the eviction notice that had arrived 3 days after her dismissal. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and the envelope Marcus had given her wouldn't even cover half of it. Her phone buzzed with another text from her mother in Guadalajara. "Mija, the doctors say we need to start the treatment soon. When can you send the money?" Elena closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For 3 years, she had sent $2,000 every month to Mexico, money for her mother's diabetes medication, her brother's engineering studies, and her sister's daycare while she worked 2 jobs. That money had come from her salary at the Wellington Mansion, a job that had consumed every hour of her day, but had given her family hope. Now, with $1,400 in her checking account and no prospects, that hope felt as distant as the glittering lights of Manhattan she could see from her tiny window. But Elena Rodriguez had not survived crossing the border at 19, working 3 jobs while studying journalism, and raising her siblings from afar by giving up easily. She opened her laptop, a 5-year-old machine she had bought used, and began typing. If Marcus Wellington thought he could erase 3 years of her life with an envelope, he was about to learn who Elena Rodriguez really was. Her first email went to Maria Santos, a journalist she had met at a community center in the Bronx 2 years earlier. Maria worked for a small Spanish-language newspaper that covered immigration stories. "Maria, it's Elena. I know we've only met a few times, but I'm ready to use my journalism degree. Do you have any freelance opportunities? I'm willing to work for very little to start building my portfolio again." The response came within an hour. "Helena, I remember you mentioning your degree. We need someone to cover a story about domestic workers' rights violations in Manhattan. It pays $200, but it could lead to more work. Are you interested?" Elena stared at the email for a long moment. A story about domestic workers' rights violations in Manhattan. The irony was almost too perfect. "I'm very interested," she typed back. "When do we start?" 2 days later, Elena found herself in a community center in Washington Heights, interviewing women who had stories remarkably similar to her own. Maria Santos, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair, watched Elena work with growing admiration. "You have a gift," Maria said as Elena finished interviewing Rosa, a housekeeper who had been fired after asking for a day off to attend her daughter's graduation. "The way you listen, the way you make them feel safe to tell their stories, that's not something you can teach." Elena looked up from her notes. "These women deserve to have their voices heard. For too long, people like Marcus Wellington have treated us as invisible, but we're not invisible. We're human beings with dreams, with families, with dignity." "Marcus Wellington?" Maria's eyebrows raised. "The tech CEO?" Elena hesitated, then nodded. "He was my former employer." "And he fired you?" "He said I didn't fit his aesthetic." Elena's voice was steady, but Maria could see the pain behind her eyes. Maria leaned forward. "Elena, I think the universe just handed us a much bigger story than domestic workers' rights violations. Are you ready to tell your story? The real story?" That night, Elena sat in her tiny apartment writing until sunrise. She wrote about the women who cleaned the penthouses of Manhattan while their own children went to bed hungry. She wrote about the immigrants who maintained the luxury lifestyles of the wealthy while being treated as less than human. And yes, she wrote about Marcus Wellington, though she was careful to focus on the systemic issues rather than personal revenge. The article was published in the small Spanish newspaper, but Maria had bigger plans. She sent it to her friend Carlos Rivera, a producer at Univision. Carlos sent it to his colleague at CNN Latino. Within a week, Elena's article about invisible workers in Manhattan's elite households was being shared across social media platforms. More importantly, it caught the attention of Rebecca Chen, an investigative journalist at Channel 7 News who had been looking for someone with Elena's unique perspective and access to cover stories about labor practices in New York's wealthiest neighborhoods. "I read your article," Rebecca said during their phone call. "It's powerful, honest, and beautifully written. I'd like to meet with you about some freelance opportunities. Real journalism, Elena, the kind that changes things." Elena looked out her small window at the Manhattan skyline, where somewhere in a penthouse, Marcus Wellington was probably sipping expensive wine without a single thought about the woman whose life he had shattered. "I'm ready," Elena said. "I'm ready to change things." But she had no idea just how much everything was about to change. 5 years had passed since that humiliating morning in the Wellington mansion, and Elena Rodriguez's life had transformed beyond recognition. The newsroom at Channel 7 News buzzed with the familiar energy of breaking stories and tight deadlines. Elena sat at her anchor desk, reviewing her notes for the evening broadcast, her transformation complete. The worn uniform had been replaced by elegant blazers. Her tired eyes now sparkled with confidence, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned every word she spoke. "2 minutes to live broadcast, Elena," called out Jake Morrison, the floor director. Elena nodded, touching the small gold cross at her neck, the only thing she still wore from her days as a domestic worker. It reminded her never to forget where she came from, and more importantly, why she was here. The path from that Queen's apartment to this anchor chair had been anything but easy. After Rebecca Chen gave her that first real opportunity, Elena had worked 18-hour days, covering every story with the passion of someone who understood struggle intimately. She reported on immigration raids, labor violations, housing discrimination, stories that other journalists overlooked because they didn't affect Manhattan's elite. But Elena's breakthrough came 2 years ago when she exposed a network of employment agencies that were trafficking undocumented workers into domestic servitude. Her 3-part investigation, The Invisible Slaves of Park Avenue, won a regional Emmy and established her as one of New York's most respected investigative journalists. The network executives noticed. Elena's ratings were exceptional, particularly among Latino viewers, but her appeal crossed all demographics. She had something rare in television news, authenticity that viewers could feel through their screens. 30 seconds, Jake announced. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Mija, watching you tonight from Guadalajara. Your father would be so proud." Her mother's diabetes was now well controlled thanks to Elena's success. Her brother had graduated as an engineer and was working in Mexico City. Her sister had just started university. Everything Marcus Wellington had tried to take from her, she had rebuilt, stronger, more beautiful, and infinitely more meaningful. "And we're live in 5, 4, 3. Elena looked directly into the camera, her voice steady and commanding. "Good evening. I'm Elena Rodriguez with Channel 7 News. Tonight we begin a special investigative series that will expose shocking labor practices in some of Manhattan's most prestigious technology companies." In the control room, Rebecca Chen smiled. This investigation had been months in the making, and Elena had insisted on leading it personally. She had a particular passion for stories about corporate abuse of power, something Rebecca attributed to Elena's background, though she didn't know the full story. "Our investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic exploitation of workers, from unpaid overtime to harassment to creating hostile work environments that force employees to accept unconscionable conditions just to keep their jobs." Elena paused, her eyes never leaving the camera. Somewhere in Manhattan, she knew, were dozens of CEOs who would sleep poorly tonight, wondering if their companies were on her list. "Over the next week, we will reveal which companies are involved, what specific violations our investigation has uncovered, And most importantly, we will give voice to the workers who have been silenced by fear, by contracts, and by a system that protects the powerful while exploiting the vulnerable. The broadcast continued for another 25 minutes, covering local politics and community events. But Elena's mind was already on tomorrow night's broadcast when she would begin naming names. At the top of her list, after months of investigation, was Quantum Meridian Technologies. Marcus Wellington had built his fortune on the backs of overworked, underpaid programmers and support staff. Elena's investigation had uncovered internal documents showing systematic wage theft, evidence of racial and gender discrimination in hiring and promotions, and a pattern of retaliation against employees who complained about working conditions. The evidence was ironclad. Elena had spent months verifying every detail, interviewing dozens of current and former employees, and working with labor law experts to ensure her reporting was bulletproof. But as the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, Elena felt a strange mix of emotions. This wasn't about revenge. She had moved far beyond that. This was about justice, about using her platform to protect workers who didn't have a voice. Still, she couldn't deny a certain satisfaction in knowing that Marcus Wellington, who had dismissed her as unworthy of his sophisticated world, would soon discover just how sophisticated Elena Rodriguez had become. "Excellent broadcast tonight," Rebecca said, approaching Elena's desk. "Are you ready for tomorrow? Once we name Quantum Meridian Technologies, there's no going back." Elena gathered her notes and looked out the newsroom windows at the glittering Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there, in a penthouse that she once cleaned, Marcus Wellington was probably enjoying another expensive dinner, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. "I've been ready for 5 years," Elena said quietly. "Tomorrow, we tell the truth." Marcus Wellington poured himself 3 fingers of Macallan 25, a $1,200 bottle of whiskey that he drank as casually as most people drink water. The crystal glass caught the lights of Manhattan's skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Upper East Side penthouse, the same penthouse that had cost him $25 million and served as the crown jewel of his empire. At 43, Marcus had reached heights that even his younger, more arrogant self had only dreamed of. Quantum Meridian Technologies had gone public 2 years ago, making him worth $3.2 billion on paper. He owned homes in the Hamptons, Aspen, and Monaco. His face graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune magazines. He was, by every measurable standard, one of the most successful men in America. But success, Marcus had learned, was a lonely companion. He settled into his Italian leather chair, the same chair where he conducted billion-dollar deals and decided the fates of thousands of employees. Tonight, however, he just wanted to unwind. The day had been particularly stressful. His head of HR had mentioned something about journalists asking questions about employee satisfaction, but Marcus had dismissed it as routine corporate harassment. He reached for the remote and flicked on the television, settling on Channel 7 News out of habit. The evening news was background noise in his life, something to fill the silence of his perfectly appointed but emotionally empty home. "Good evening, I'm Elena Rodriguez with Channel 7 News." Marcus's hand froze halfway to his mouth, the crystal glass suspended in air. That voice, that familiar cadence, those carefully pronounced words with just the slightest hint of an accent that spoke of resilience and authenticity. He looked up at the screen and nearly dropped his $200 worth of whiskey. The woman on his television was stunning, elegant in a way that transcended mere beauty. Her dark hair was styled perfectly, her makeup was flawless, and she wore a navy blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. But it was her eyes that held Marcus captive, intelligent, confident, and filled with a quiet strength that commanded attention. Tonight, we continue our investigative series exposing labor violations in Manhattan's technology sector. Marcus's mouth went dry. This couldn't be the same woman. This sophisticated, articulate journalist couldn't possibly be the domestic worker he had dismissed 5 years ago for not meeting his aesthetic standards. But as Elena continued speaking, every word confirmed what Marcus's shocked mind was struggling to accept. The voice was unmistakable. The slight tilt of her head when she paused for emphasis, the way her hands moved gracefully as she gestured. These were details that suddenly came flooding back from memories he thought he had forgotten. Our investigation has revealed systematic patterns of abuse that affect thousands of workers across multiple companies. Marcus lunged for his laptop, his fingers trembling as he typed Elena Rodriguez Channel 7 into the search engine. The results that populated made his blood run cold. Emmy Award-winning journalist Elena Rodriguez. Rodriguez's groundbreaking investigation into labor trafficking, named one of New York's most influential Latina professionals. Article after article, photograph after photograph, all showing the same impossible truth. The woman he had dismissed as beneath his notice had become one of the most respected journalists in New York. Marcus scrolled through her biography on the Channel 7 website. Elena Rodriguez holds a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University and a bachelor's degree from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. She began her career covering immigration and labor issues before transitioning to investigative journalism. The words blurred together as Marcus tried to process what he was reading. She had a master's degree from Columbia. She had been educated, professional, accomplished, and he had treated her like she was nothing more than a piece of furniture that didn't match his decor. On the television, Elena was wrapping up the evening's broadcast. Tomorrow night, we will reveal the first company in our investigation, including internal documents that show a pattern of deliberate exploitation of vulnerable workers. This is Channel 7 News. I'm Elena Rodriguez. Good night. Phone. As the camera held her face for a final moment before cutting to commercial, Elena's eyes seemed to look directly through the screen at Marcus. There was no anger there, no hint of vendetta. There was something far more unsettling, the calm confidence of someone who held all the cards and was simply waiting for the right moment to play them. Marcus's phone rang, startling him from his trance. The caller ID showed his corporate attorney, Jonathan Blackwood. "Marcus, we have a problem." Jonathan's voice was tight with concern. "I've been getting calls from Channel 7 News. They're asking very specific questions about employment practices at Quantum Meridian Technologies. Very specific questions." "What kind of questions?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Questions about overtime policies, workplace harassment complaints, hiring practices. They mentioned they have internal documents." "Marcus, they know things that only someone with inside access could know." As Jonathan continued talking about legal strategies and damage control, Marcus stared at the now dark television screen where Elena's face had been moments before. 5 years ago, he had looked at Elena Rodriguez and seen nothing more than a cleaning lady who didn't fit his image. Tonight, he realized he had been looking at one of the most dangerous people in his world, a brilliant journalist with intimate knowledge of his business, unlimited access to media platforms, and absolutely nothing left to lose. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Wellington was truly afraid. The Channel 7 newsroom hummed with the electric energy that only came with a major breaking story. Elena sat in the makeup chair, her mind focused not on the foundation being applied to her face, but on the stack of documents that would change everything for Marcus Wellington. 5 minutes to air, Elena, called production assistant Sarah Kim. Elena nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the manila folder beside her. Inside were internal memos from Quantum Meridian Technologies, email chains between executives, and testimonies from 17 current and former employees. Each document was a piece of a puzzle that revealed a company built on systematic exploitation. The investigation had taken 8 months. Elena and her team had worked with employment lawyers, labor advocates, and whistleblowers to build an airtight case. What they discovered went far beyond typical corporate misconduct. It was a deliberate, coordinated effort to extract maximum profit from vulnerable workers. "How are you feeling?" Rebecca Chen asked, approaching Elena's chair. As senior producer, Rebecca had overseen every aspect of the investigation, but she could see the weight of tonight's broadcast in Elena's eyes. "Ready," Elena replied simply. But Rebecca caught something else in her voice. Not nervousness, but the gravity of someone about to change lives forever. Elena had insisted on complete objectivity throughout the investigation. She never mentioned her personal history with Marcus Wellington to her team. This wasn't about settling old scores. It was about protecting workers who couldn't protect themselves. "Remember," Rebecca said, "Marcus Wellington's legal team has already sent 3 cease and desist letters. They're watching every word." Elena smiled grimly. "Let them watch." At 8:47 p.m., Elena took her position behind the anchor desk. The studio lights were hot against her face, but her hands were steady as she arranged her notes. Somewhere in Manhattan, Marcus Wellington was probably watching, just as she had planned. "Good evening. I'm Elena Rodriguez with the Channel 7 News Special Investigation. Tonight, we expose a pattern of systematic labor abuse at one of New York's most successful technology companies." Elena paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Quantum Meridian Technologies, valued at over $4 billion and led by CEO Marcus Wellington, has built its fortune through what can only be described as deliberate exploitation of its workforce. In his penthouse, Marcus Wellington felt his world tilt on its axis. Elena continued, her voice calm and professional. "Our 8-month investigation has uncovered internal documents showing that Quantum Meridian Technologies routinely classifies full-time employees as contractors to avoid paying benefits. Workers report being forced to work 60 to 70-hour weeks while being paid for only 40. The first document appeared on screen. An internal memo with Marcus's signature approving a policy to reclassify customer service representatives as independent contractors. But the abuses go far deeper than wage theft, Elena said. "We have documented evidence of racial discrimination in hiring practices, sexual harassment complaints that were buried by management, and retaliation against employees who attempted to organize or file complaints." Elena's voice never wavered, never showed emotion. She presented each piece of evidence like the seasoned investigative journalist she had become. But behind her professional demeanor was a woman who understood exactly what these workers had endured. Maria Gonzalez worked for Quantum Meridian Technologies for 3 years as a customer support representative. Despite excellent performance reviews, she was repeatedly passed over for promotion, while less qualified men were advanced. When she filed a complaint with HR, she was placed on a performance improvement plan and eventually terminated. Maria's face filled the screen as she spoke, in silhouetted profile to protect her identity. "I loved that job," Maria said. "I gave everything to that company, but they made it clear that people like me, women, Latinas, we weren't management material. We were just disposable." Elena felt her heart clench as she heard the pain in Maria's voice. It was the same pain she had felt 5 years ago, walking out of Marcus Wellington's mansion, with her dignity intact, but her future shattered. David Chen, a software developer at Quantum Meridian Technologies, attempted to organize his co-workers to petition for better working conditions. According to internal emails we obtained, Mr. Chen was placed under surveillance by a private security firm hired by the company. He was fired 2 weeks later. The documents kept coming, emails between executives joking about problem employees, budget memos showing money allocated for union-busting consultants, performance reviews that showed clear patterns of discrimination. Perhaps most disturbing, Elena continued, are the recordings we obtained of management meetings where executives discussed strategies to identify and eliminate employees who might be organizing or planning to file complaints. A partial audio recording played, Marcus Wellington's voice clearly audible. "We need to be proactive about these troublemakers. I don't care if they're good workers. Anyone who rocks the boat needs to go." Elena looked directly into the camera. When contacted for comment, Quantum Meridian Technologies denied all allegations and claimed that any employment issues were isolated incidents handled appropriately. However, the evidence suggests a pattern of deliberate, systematic abuse that goes to the very top of the organization. As the broadcast concluded, Elena delivered her final words with the quiet authority of someone who had lived through similar injustices. These are not isolated incidents. These are not misunderstandings. This is a pattern of powerful people believing that their success gives them the right to treat other human beings as disposable resources. Tomorrow night, we will reveal additional companies in our investigation and explore how these practices have become endemic in Manhattan's technology sector. The red recording light went dark, and Elena sat in the sudden silence of the studio. Around her, the production crew began their post-broadcast routine, but Elena remained still, processing what had just happened. She had just declared war on one of the most powerful men in New York. But unlike 5 years ago, this time she wasn't defenseless. This time, she had the truth, the evidence, and a platform that reached millions of people. Her phone was already buzzing with calls from other news outlets, from lawyers, from advocacy groups. But Elena ignored them all. Tomorrow would bring the inevitable counterattack from Quantum Meridian Technologies, the legal threats, the attempts to discredit her reporting. Tonight, however, belonged to Maria Gonzalez, David Chen, and all the other workers whose voices had finally been heard. Don't worry. The law offices of Blackwood and Associates on Park Avenue buzzed with crisis mode energy at 11 p.m. Marcus Wellington paced behind the mahogany conference table, while 3 of New York's most expensive lawyers scrambled to contain what was quickly becoming a corporate nightmare. "The phones haven't stopped ringing," said Jonathan Blackwood, Marcus's lead attorney for over a decade. "The Labor Department, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the New York Attorney General's office, they all want meetings tomorrow." Marcus stopped pacing and slammed his fist on the table. How did she get those documents? Those emails were supposed to be privileged corporate communications. "Someone leaked them," said Patricia Williams, the crisis management specialist they had called in. "And judging by the breadth of material, it wasn't just one person. This looks like a coordinated effort by multiple insiders." Marcus felt the walls closing in. "What about that recording? My voice discussing problem employees?" "That was from the quarterly management meeting 8 months ago," Jonathan replied grimly, "which means someone has been planning this for a very long time." On the conference room's large screen, Channel 7's website displayed Elena's investigation with devastating clarity. The article had been shared over 50,000 times in 3 hours. The Quantum Meridian scandal was trending on Twitter. The company's stock had already dropped 12% in after-hours trading. But Marcus wasn't thinking about stock prices. He was thinking about the woman he had dismissed 5 years ago and how spectacularly he had underestimated her. Meanwhile, across town in her modest Upper West Side apartment, Elena Rodriguez sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open to dozens of emails flooding in from sources, supporters, and journalists requesting interviews. But her attention was focused on the secure folder beside her computer, evidence that would make tonight's broadcast look like a gentle introduction. Her phone rang. Rebecca Chen's name appeared on the screen. "Elena, are you seeing the response to tonight's broadcast?" Rebecca's voice was electric with excitement. "The website crashed twice from traffic. CNN wants you for their morning show. The Times is requesting an exclusive follow-up interview." "That's good," Elena replied calmly. "But we're not done yet." "What do you mean?" Elena opened the secure folder and spread several documents across her table. "What we revealed tonight was just the documented labor violations. Tomorrow night, we reveal the financial crimes." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Financial crimes?" "Tax evasion, securities fraud, money laundering through offshore accounts. Marcus Wellington didn't just exploit his workers, he stole from them, from shareholders, and from taxpayers." Elena's voice carried the weight of months of investigation. "We have bank records, Patricia, email communications with his accountants about hiding income, documents showing he claimed false deductions by listing personal expenses as business costs." "Elena, if what you're saying is true, this goes beyond labor violations. This is federal criminal territory." "I know exactly what this is," Elena said quietly, "and I have every document needed to prove it." The evidence had come from an unexpected source, Marcus's former chief financial officer, Robert Hayes, who had been fired 6 months earlier for questioning some of Quantum Meridian Technologies' more creative accounting practices. Hayes had kept copies of everything, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. When he reached out to Elena through an intermediary, he had said simply, "Marcus Wellington destroyed my career because I wouldn't help him cook the books. Maybe it's time for some justice." Elena spread out the bank statements showing wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. She reviewed the emails where Marcus discussed listing his personal yacht maintenance as a corporate research vessel expense. She examined the documents showing how Quantum Meridian Technologies had created shell companies to hide revenue and avoid paying corporate taxes. But the most damning evidence was a recorded phone call between Marcus and his personal accountant, discussing how to backdate stock options to maximize his personal profits while lying to shareholders about the company's financial health. "The recording you played tonight was powerful," Rebecca said. "But Elena, if you have evidence of federal crimes, shouldn't we be working with the FBI?" "We are," Elena replied. "I've been in contact with Agent Sarah Martinez from the Financial Crimes Unit for 3 weeks. They're building their own case, but they asked us to proceed with our broadcast to put public pressure on Wellington and his associates." Elena's doorbell rang. Through her peephole, she saw a man in an expensive suit standing nervously in the hallway. "Rebecca, I need to call you back," Elena said, ending the call. She opened the door to find David Chen, the software developer whose story she had featured in tonight's broadcast. "Ms. Rodriguez," David said, his hands shaking slightly, "I'm sorry to show up unannounced, but I needed to tell you something important." "Come in, David. What is it?" David sat on Elena's couch, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "After your broadcast aired tonight, I got a call from Marcus Wellington himself." Elena's blood chilled. "What did he say?" "He offered me $2 million to recant my story. He said I misunderstood what happened, that if I issued a public statement saying the reporting was inaccurate, Quantum Meridian Technologies would hire me back with a promotion and a huge raise." "And if you refused?" David's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said I would never work in tech again. He said he had friends at every major company in the industry, and that he would make sure I was blacklisted permanently." Elena felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same anger she had felt 5 years ago when Marcus had tried to reduce her to nothing. But now that anger was tempered by knowledge, by resources, and by the power of truth. "David, I need you to write down everything Marcus said, word for word, and I need you to know that we're going to protect you. This story is bigger than either of us now." As David began writing his statement, Elena looked out her apartment window at the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there, Marcus Wellington was probably making more phone calls, offering more bribes, making more threats. But he had made one crucial mistake. He was still thinking like the arrogant CEO who could dismiss inconvenient people with a wave of his hand. He didn't understand that Elena Rodriguez was no longer someone who could be dismissed. Tomorrow night she would show him exactly how dangerous his underestimation had been. The imposing glass tower of Quantum Meridian Technologies reflected the gray morning sky as FBI agents in dark suits filed through the lobby at 6 a.m. sharp. Elena Rodriguez stood across the street, her press badge hanging around her neck, watching as federal law enforcement executed search warrants on every floor of the building. "Elena, we're live in 30 seconds, said cameraman Tom Bradley, adjusting his equipment to capture the dramatic scene. Elena had broken the financial crimes story just 12 hours earlier. Her second broadcast had been even more devastating than the first, complete with bank records, recorded phone calls, and documentation of a criminal enterprise that went far beyond labor violations. The response had been swift and decisive. By midnight, the U.S. Attorney's Office had obtained warrants. By dawn, agents were seizing computers, financial records, and personal effects from Marcus Wellington's corporate empire. This is Elena Rodriguez reporting live from downtown Manhattan, where federal agents are executing search warrants at Quantum Meridian Technologies as part of an ongoing investigation into securities fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. Elena's voice was steady as she described the scene, but inside she felt the weight of this moment. 5 years ago she had been powerless against Marcus Wellington's cruelty. Today she was watching his empire crumble in real time. Her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered, "Ms. Rodriguez." The voice was unmistakable. Marcus Wellington, but not the arrogant CEO, she remembered. This voice was desperate, broken. "We need to talk." Elena stepped away from the camera crew. "Mr. Wellington, if you want to make a statement, you should contact our newsroom through official channels." "Elena, please." The use of her first name was jarring. "Not as a journalist, as someone I wronged, terribly. I need to explain." "There's nothing to explain, Mr. Wellington. The evidence speaks for itself." 5 minutes, Marcus pleaded. "Just give me 5 minutes to apologize for what I did to you, for how I treated you." "You have every right to destroy me, but please, let me at least acknowledge what a terrible human being I was." Elena looked across the street at the federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from the building where Marcus had once reigned supreme. Part of her wanted to hang up, to let justice take its course, without any personal interaction. But another part, the part that had spent 5 years transforming pain into purpose, recognized that this conversation was necessary. "The coffee shop on 42nd and Lexington. 1 hour. You come alone." An hour later, Elena sat in a corner booth of the small cafe, watching Marcus Wellington walk through the door. She barely recognized him. The perfectly groomed CEO had been replaced by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone whose world had completely collapsed. He sat across from her, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Elena studied his face, searching for any sign of the arrogant man who had dismissed her so cruelly. What she saw instead was someone who appeared genuinely broken. "You have 5 minutes," she said. Marcus took a shaky breath. "I've spent the last 2 days thinking about that morning 5 years ago, about what I said to you, how I treated you. And I've realized something that should have been obvious but wasn't. I never saw you as a human being." Elena remained silent, letting him continue. "You worked in my home for 3 years. You took care of everything, made my life possible. And I never once asked about your family, your dreams, your background. I never even asked your last name." His voice cracked slightly. "I looked at you and saw a service, not a person." "And now?" Elena asked quietly. "Now I've spent 2 days reading everything you've written, watching every story you've reported. I've learned more about you in 48 hours than I did in 3 years of seeing you every day." Marcus looked directly at her. "You're brilliant, Elena. You're accomplished, educated, and you've done more to help people in 5 years than I've done in my entire life." Elena felt a strange mix of emotions. This wasn't the conversation she had expected. "You want to know the most shameful part?" Marcus continued. "When I saw you on television 3 nights ago, my first thought wasn't regret for how I treated you. It was shock that someone I had dismissed as beneath my standards had become so successful. Even then, even after everything, I was still thinking like the same arrogant man who ruined your life." "You didn't ruin my life, Mr. Wellington," Elena said firmly. "You changed its direction. Everything good that has happened to me in the last 5 years happened because I refused to let your cruelty define my worth." Marcus winced as if her words had physically struck him. "I know I have no right to ask this, but I need to know. Was this investigation personal? Was it about what I did to you?" Elena considered lying, considered letting him believe that her professional success had been motivated entirely by revenge. But that wasn't who she was. "When my team first suggested investigating quantum meridian technologies, I almost refused to participate because of our history. But then I learned about Maria Gonzalez, David Chen, and all the others. I realized that what you did to me wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. You've been treating people as disposable your entire career. So this was about justice, not revenge. Justice and revenge aren't always the same thing, Mr. Wellington. Justice is about protecting people who can't protect themselves. Revenge is about making someone pay for hurting you personally." Elena paused. "What's happening to you now is justice. The fact that it's also personally satisfying, well, I'm human." Marcus nodded slowly. "The financial crimes they're investigating, everything you reported is true, isn't it?" "Yes." "And you have enough evidence to convict me?" "Yes." Marcus sat back in his chair, the weight of his situation finally settling in completely. "I'm going to prison." "Probably." They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation hanging between them. "Elena," Marcus said finally, "I know this means nothing coming from me, and I know it's far too late, but I am deeply, profoundly sorry for what I did to you, not just for firing you, but for the way I did it, for making you feel like you were somehow less than human. You deserve dignity and respect, and I gave you cruelty instead." Elena looked at this broken man across from her and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but a kind of closure she hadn't realized she needed. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "It doesn't change anything that's happened, but thank you." Marcus stood to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you won, not just against me, but in life. You deserved everything you've achieved." "Alea!" As Elena watched him walk away, she realized that this conversation had given her something she hadn't known she was missing, the knowledge that Marcus Wellington finally understood exactly who Elena Rodriguez was and always had been. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was packed with reporters, former Quantum Meridian Technologies employees, and curious onlookers. Elena Rodriguez sat in the press section, her notebook ready, watching as Marcus Wellington was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. The trial had been a media sensation. Every day brought new revelations about the scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise. The evidence Elena had helped uncover was just the beginning. Federal investigators had discovered a web of corruption that stretched back over a decade. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Martinez," the bailiff announced. Elena watched as Marcus stood with his court-appointed attorney. His transformation over the past 6 months had been stark. The billionaire CEO was gone, replaced by a man who looked genuinely haunted by his actions. His family had abandoned him, his friends had distanced themselves, and his fortune had been frozen by federal asset forfeiture proceedings. Mr. Wellington, Judge Martinez said, her voice carrying the weight of justice, you have been found guilty on 18 federal charges, including securities fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and racketeering. Before I impose sentence, do you wish to make a statement? Marcus stood slowly. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but the courtroom's acoustics carried every word. Your Honor, I stand before you today as a man who destroyed lives for profit. I exploited workers, stole from shareholders, and corrupted everything I touched in pursuit of wealth and power. Elena found herself leaning forward, surprised by the genuine remorse in his voice. I want to specifically acknowledge the courage of the journalists and whistleblowers who exposed my crimes, particularly Ms. Elena Rodriguez of Channel 7 News. Ms. Rodriguez, I know you're in the courtroom today, and I want to say publicly what I should have recognized years ago. Your integrity, your dedication to truth, and your compassion for others represent everything I failed to be. Elena felt the eyes of the courtroom turn toward her, but she kept her focus on Marcus. I also want to acknowledge the employees I exploited, the families I hurt, and the communities I damaged through my greed. No sentence this court imposes will undo the harm I've caused, but I hope that my downfall serves as a warning to others who might follow the same destructive path. Marcus sat down, and Judge Martinez consulted her notes before speaking. Mr. Wellington, your crimes were not impulsive mistakes. They were calculated, systematic abuses of power that continued for over a decade. You used your position to exploit vulnerable workers and defraud investors while living in luxury built on lies and theft. The judge paused, letting her words sink in. However, the court also recognizes your cooperation with federal investigators, your complete acceptance of responsibility, and what appears to be genuine remorse for your actions. Taking all factors into consideration, this court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, and orders you to pay full restitution to victims totaling $847 million. The gavel fell with finality. 12 years. Elena watched as Marcus was led away in shackles, his head bowed, but his posture somehow more dignified than she had seen in years. Outside the courthouse, Elena faced a wall of reporters and cameras. Ms. Rodriguez, how does it feel to see Marcus Wellington sentenced to prison? Asked a reporter from CNN. Elena chose her words carefully. Justice was served today, not just for Marcus Wellington's crimes, but for every worker who was exploited, every family that suffered because of his greed. This case proves that no one is above the law, regardless of wealth or power. Do you feel vindicated by today's sentence? Another reporter asked. Elena paused, thinking about the question. Vindication isn't the right word. This was never about personal satisfaction. It was about ensuring that powerful people who abuse others face consequences for their actions. What's next for you professionally? I'll continue doing what I've always done, investigating stories that matter, giving voice to people who need advocates, and holding the powerful accountable. That's what journalism is supposed to do. As Elena walked away from the courthouse, her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Chen. Incredible work, Elena. You changed everything. Dinner tonight to celebrate? Elena smiled and typed back, not to celebrate, to plan our next investigation. That evening, Elena sat in her apartment, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The lights of the city twinkled like stars, each one representing lives, dreams, and stories waiting to be told. Her laptop was open to dozens of emails from sources, whistleblowers, and ordinary people who had seen her Quantum Meridian Technologies investigation and wanted help exposing other corporate wrongdoing. There was a pharmaceutical company suppressing safety data, a real estate firm discriminating against minority applicants, and a tech startup stealing workers' intellectual property. Elena had become more than just a journalist. She had become a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to be silenced by power and wealth. But as satisfying as Marcus Wellington's conviction was, Elena knew her real victory wasn't his imprisonment. Her real victory was the life she had built, the stories she had told, and the people she had helped along the way. Marcus Wellington was going to prison, where he would have 12 years to reflect on the choices that had brought him there. Elena Rodriguez was going back to work, where she would continue fighting for justice, one story at a time. The woman who had once been dismissed as unworthy of a wealthy man's notice had become one of the most powerful voices for justice in New York City. And she was just getting started. 3 years had passed since Marcus Wellington's sentencing, and Elena Rodriguez had become one of the most respected investigative journalists in America. Her exposés had led to reforms in labor law, the creation of new federal oversight agencies, and the prosecution of dozens of corporate executives. But on this crisp October morning, Elena found herself in an unusual position, sitting across from Marcus Wellington in the visiting room of the Federal Correctional Institution in Otisville, New York. The man who sat before her bore little resemblance to the arrogant CEO she had once known. Prison had changed Marcus in ways that went far beyond his appearance. His hair was now completely gray, his expensive suits replaced by standard prison clothing, but it was his eyes that showed the most dramatic transformation. They held a depth of understanding and genuine humility that had never existed before. "Thank you for coming," Marcus said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." Elena studied his face, searching for any trace of manipulation or self-serving agenda. What she found instead was something she hadn't expected: peace. "Your letter was different from what I expected," Elena replied. "You said you wanted to discuss something important, not related to your case or appeals." Marcus nodded. "There are no appeals, Elena. I'm guilty of everything they convicted me of, and probably more. I've spent 3 years in here coming to terms with the person I was, and more importantly, trying to understand how I became that person." "And what have you discovered?" "That wealth and power didn't corrupt me. They revealed who I already was. I was always someone who saw other people as means to an end, always someone who believed my success made me inherently more valuable than others." Marcus's voice carried the weight of hard-won self-awareness. "Prison didn't break me, Elena. It finally forced me to see myself clearly." Elena remained silent, letting him continue. "I've been working with Dr. Sarah Chen. She's a psychologist who volunteers here. She's helped me understand that my behavior wasn't just criminal, it was fundamentally inhuman. I treated people like disposable objects because I never learned to see others as fully human." "Why are you telling me this, Marcus?" "Because you were the first person to show me what real dignity looked like. When I fired you that day, you didn't beg. You didn't lose your composure. You didn't try to negotiate. You just said, 'I hope someday you understand what you're losing today,' and walked away with your head held high." Elena remembered that moment vividly, how she had felt her world crashing down, but had refused to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Those words haunted me for years," Marcus continued, "even before your investigation, even before my arrest. I would wake up some nights thinking about what I had lost that day. Not just a good employee, I had lost the chance to know an extraordinary human being." "Marcus, why did you really ask me to come here?" Marcus took a deep breath. Because I need to ask for something I don't deserve and have no right to request. I need to ask for your forgiveness. Elena felt her chest tighten. Forgiveness. Not for the legal consequences I deserve every day of this sentence. And not to make myself feel better, I've accepted that I'll carry the guilt of my actions for the rest of my life. Marcus leaned forward slightly. I'm asking for forgiveness because you deserve the peace that comes with letting go of anger, because holding on to resentment against me might prevent you from being completely free. Elena stared at him, stunned by the selflessness of the request. This wasn't the Marcus Wellington she had known, the man who took everything and gave nothing back. You've spent 5 years building an incredible life and career, Marcus continued. You've helped countless people, exposed injustice, and become exactly the kind of person this world needs more of. But if some part of you is still carrying anger about what I did, then I'm still hurting you, even from prison. Elena felt tears building in her eyes, not from sadness, but from something more complex. She realized that Marcus was right. Somewhere deep inside, she had been carrying the weight of that humiliation, using it as fuel for her success, but also as a barrier to complete peace. Marcus, she said softly, I forgave you a long time ago, not because you deserved it, but because I deserved to be free from anger. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, he whispered. But I want you to understand something, Elena continued. My forgiveness doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't make your crimes acceptable, and it doesn't mean you don't deserve the consequences you're facing. I understand completely. Forgiveness isn't about you, Marcus. It's about me choosing not to let your past cruelty have power over my present happiness. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years of pain and anger finally lifting from both of them. Elena, Marcus said finally, I want you to know that everything good that's happened in my life since my arrest, the therapy, the self-reflection, the genuine relationships I've built with other inmates, it all started with watching your investigation and realizing what real integrity looked like. What do you mean? You could have destroyed me completely. You had evidence of personal affairs, of petty cruelties that weren't illegal, but would have humiliated me publicly. But you only reported what served justice, never what served revenge. You showed me that strength isn't about having power over others. It's about using whatever power you have responsibly. Elena smiled slightly. I learned that from my mother. She used to say, Mija, how you treat people who can't fight back reveals who you really are. Your mother raised an extraordinary daughter. As their visit came to an end, Elena stood to leave. Marcus, what will you do when you're released? I have 9 years left to figure that out, but I know it will involve trying to help people somehow, maybe working with organizations that help ex-convicts find employment, maybe volunteering with immigrant rights groups. He paused. I'll never be able to undo the harm I caused, but maybe I can prevent others from making the same mistakes. Elena extended her hand. I hope you find peace, Marcus. Real peace. Marcus shook her hand, his grip firm but humble. I already have, Elena. Thanks to you. As Elena walked out of the prison into the crisp autumn air, she felt lighter than she had in years. Not because Marcus Wellington had suffered consequences for his actions, but because she had finally released the last hold his cruelty had on her heart. She had truly forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own. And in doing so, she had completed her own transformation from victim to victor, from someone who had been broken by injustice to someone who could heal others through the power of truth and compassion. Elena Rodriguez was finally completely free. 9 years later, Elena Rodriguez stood behind the podium at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, addressing a packed auditorium of students, faculty, and media professionals. At 39, she had become more than just a successful journalist. She was a mentor, an advocate, and a symbol of resilience for countless people who had faced adversity. "The power of journalism," Elena said, her voice carrying the confidence earned through years of fighting for truth, "isn't just in exposing corruption or holding the powerful accountable. It's in giving voice to those who have been silenced, in telling stories that need to be told, and in believing that every human being deserves dignity and respect." The audience hung on every word. Elena's reputation had grown far beyond her initial investigation of quantum meridian technologies. She had exposed pharmaceutical companies hiding deadly side effects, revealed systematic discrimination in the housing industry, and uncovered a network of private prisons profiting from immigrant detention. Each investigation had been more impactful than the last, but all were guided by the same principle, using her platform to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "But perhaps most importantly," Elena continued, "journalism teaches us that everyone's story matters. The domestic worker, the factory employee, the undocumented immigrant, their experiences, their struggles, their triumphs are just as newsworthy as those of CEOs and politicians." In the audience, a young Latina student raised her hand. "Ms. Rodriguez, what advice do you have for journalists from underrepresented communities who want to make a difference?" Elena smiled, remembering her own journey from that cramped Queens apartment to this prestigious podium. "Never let anyone convince you that your background is a limitation. Your experiences, your perspective, the communities you come from. These aren't obstacles to overcome. They're superpowers that allow you to see stories others might miss and to tell them with authenticity others can't match." After the lecture, Elena walked across Columbia's campus to her favorite coffee shop near the journalism building. She had recently been offered a position as a full professor at the university, with the freedom to continue her investigative work while training the next generation of journalists. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Chen, who had become Deputy Director of News at Channel 7. "Elena, I have someone who wants to meet you. Says he has a story that could change everything. Can you meet tomorrow?" Elena smiled. Even after all these years, the promise of a new investigation, a new opportunity to seek justice, still excited her. That evening, Elena returned to her spacious apartment on the Upper West Side. A far cry from that tiny Queens studio where she had restarted her life. The walls were decorated with her Emmy Awards, her Pulitzer Prize, and photographs from her travels covering stories around the world. But her most treasured possession was a framed letter on her desk, not from a colleague or a viewer, but from her mother in Guadalajara. "Mija," the letter read in Spanish, "watching you on television tonight, I remembered something your father used to say. The measure of a person isn't how they handle success, but how they handle failure. You were fired from a job and used that pain to build something beautiful. You were humiliated and turned that humiliation into power to help others. Your father would be so proud of who you've become." Elena touched the small gold cross at her neck, the same one she had worn during those difficult days after her dismissal from the Wellington mansion. She had kept it as a reminder of where she came from and what she had overcome. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender's name made her pause. Marcus Wellington. Elena hadn't heard from Marcus since that visit to the prison 6 years ago. She opened the email with curiosity rather than apprehension. "Dear Elena, I was released from federal prison last month after serving my full sentence. I wanted you to know that I've spent every day of the past 12 years trying to become the kind of person who deserved the forgiveness you gave me. I'm now working with the Immigrant Workers Justice Center in Queens, helping people navigate labor violations and connecting them with legal resources. It's not glamorous work, and it doesn't pay much, but it's the most meaningful thing I've ever done. I've been following your career from prison, and I'm amazed by everything you've accomplished. You've become exactly what I always should have been. Someone who uses their influence to lift others up rather than tear them down. I don't expect a response to this email. I just wanted you to know that the man who once fired you for being beneath his standards now spends his days learning from people whose shoes he was never worthy to shine. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. With deep respect and gratitude, Marcus. Eleanor read the email twice, then leaned back in her chair. The man who had once represented everything cruel and superficial about wealth and power had apparently become someone dedicated to helping the very people he had once exploited. She wondered if she should respond, then decided against it. Marcus's transformation was his own journey now, just as her success was hers. They had both moved beyond that moment 12 years ago when their lives had intersected so painfully. Elena closed the laptop and looked out her window at the glittering Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there in Queens, Marcus Wellington was probably working late at a community center, trying to help people who reminded him of who she had once been. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had forgiven him, not because he deserved it, but because she deserved peace. Now, it seemed, he had found his own way to peace through service to others. Elena picked up her phone and called her mother in Guadalajara. "Mommy," she said when her mother answered, "I love you, and I wanted you to know that everything you and Papa taught me about treating people with dignity, it changed the world." "Ay, mija," her mother laughed. "You changed the world. We just taught you to be human." As Elena talked with her mother, planning her upcoming visit to Mexico, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been broken down by cruelty and built herself back up through determination. She had faced injustice and responded with truth. She had been given the power to seek revenge and had chosen justice instead. Most importantly, she had learned that true strength wasn't about having power over others. It was about using whatever power you had to make the world a little more just, a little more compassionate, and a little more human. Elena Rodriguez had become exactly who she was meant to be. 5 years had passed since Marcus Wellington's release from prison, and his life had settled into a rhythm that would have been unrecognizable to the man he once was. Every morning at 6 a.m. he walked from his modest one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, to the Immigrant Workers Justice Center, where he had become the lead advocate for domestic workers' rights. The center was housed in a converted warehouse, its walls covered with multilingual posters about workers' rights, immigration services, and educational programs. Marcus's office was barely larger than a closet, furnished with a second-hand desk and 2 folding chairs. On his desk sat a single photograph, not of mansions or yachts, but of the 23 families he had helped secure fair wages and safe working conditions in the past year. "Marcus, we have a situation," said Carmen Delgado, the center's director, entering his office with urgency in her voice. "There's a young woman here, domestic worker, just fired under suspicious circumstances. The family is threatening deportation if she pursues legal action." Marcus looked up from the case files he'd been reviewing. "What's her name?" "Sofia Morales. She's 19, been in the country for 6 months, sending money back to her sick mother in El Salvador." The parallels to Elena Rodriguez's story weren't lost on Marcus. Over the past 5 years, he had heard variations of the same narrative dozens of times. Hard-working immigrants dismissed by wealthy employers who saw them as disposable. "I'll speak with her," Marcus said, standing and straightening his simple button-down shirt. His wardrobe now consisted of clothes from thrift stores and donations, a far cry from his former collection of $5,000 suits. Sofia Morales sat in the center's main room, clutching a plastic bag containing her few possessions. Her eyes were red from crying, but Marcus could see the same dignity in her posture that he remembered from Elena years ago. "Sophia," Marcus said gently, sitting across from her, "my name is Marcus. I'm here to help. Can you tell me what happened?" Sophia's story unfolded with painful familiarity. She had worked for the Blackstone family on the Upper East Side, the same Blackstones whom Marcus had once desperately tried to impress. She had been fired for attitude problems after asking for a single day off to call her mother in the hospital. "Mr. Blackstone said I was ungrateful," Sophia said in broken English. "Said I should be thankful for the opportunity to work in America. When I asked for my final pay, he said if I caused trouble, he would call immigration." Marcus felt the old anger rising in his chest, not the selfish anger of his past, but a protective fury for this young woman who reminded him so much of Elena. "Sophia," Marcus said carefully, "I need you to know that what happened to you was illegal. You have rights, regardless of your immigration status. And I promise you, we will get your money and make sure the Blackstones understand they cannot treat people this way." "But I'm scared," Sophia whispered. "If they call immigration." "Ocha." "They won't," Marcus said with quiet conviction, "because I'm going to make sure they understand exactly what kind of legal trouble they'll face if they retaliate against you." Marcus spent the next week building Sophia's case, documenting the wage theft and investigating the Blackstones' employment practices. What he discovered was a pattern of abuse involving multiple domestic workers over several years. But this case was different from others Marcus had handled. Thomas Blackstone wasn't just any wealthy employer. He was the same investor Marcus had once desperately tried to impress with his sophisticated aesthetic, the man for whom Marcus had fired Elena Rodriguez all those years ago. The irony was profound, but Marcus felt no satisfaction in it, only determination to protect Sophia from experiencing the same humiliation Elena had endured. On Friday afternoon, Marcus walked into the marble lobby of Blackstone Investment Group's Manhattan offices. The security guard barely glanced at this modestly dressed man with graying hair, assuming he was making a delivery or performing some service. "I'm here to see Thomas Blackstone," Marcus told the receptionist. "My name is Marcus Wellington." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly as she recognized the name, though the man before her bore no resemblance to the billionaire CEO who had once graced magazine covers. 10 minutes later, Marcus sat across from Thomas Blackstone in an office that rivaled his former penthouse in ostentation. Blackstone, now in his 60s, looked exactly as Marcus remembered, arrogant, entitled, and completely comfortable with his power over others. "Marcus Wellington," Blackstone said, with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "I heard you'd fallen on hard times, but I didn't realize how far you'd fallen. What are you doing here?" "I'm here about Sophia Morales," Marcus said calmly. "Who?" "The young woman you fired last week from your household staff. The one you threatened with deportation when she asked for her final wages." Blackstone leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to mild annoyance. "I have no idea what you're talking about, and even if I did, I can't imagine why it would be any business of yours." Marcus pulled out a manila folder and placed it on Blackstone's desk. "Because I represent Sophia through the Immigrant Workers Justice Center, and because what you did to her was illegal under both state and federal law." "You?" Blackstone laughed harshly. "You're representing domestic workers? Marcus, you used to fire people for sport. What happened to you in prison?" "I learned what you apparently never did," Marcus replied evenly, "that how we treat the most vulnerable people in our society is the true measure of our character." Marcus opened the folder and spread out documents across Blackstone's desk. "These are payroll records showing systematic underpayment of domestic staff. These are recordings of conversations where you and your wife discuss strategies to avoid paying overtime. And this is a sworn affidavit from Sophia detailing the threats you made against her. Blackstone's amusement faded as he realized the scope of the evidence. Thomas, Marcus continued, using his former peer's first name deliberately, you're going to pay Sophia her full wages, plus overtime, plus damages for the emotional distress you caused. You're also going to reform your employment practices and submit to monitoring by the Department of Labor. And if I refuse? Then this case becomes a federal investigation, just like mine was. And unlike me, you won't have the luxury of cooperating with authorities from the beginning. Marcus leaned forward. I spent 12 years in prison, Thomas. I know exactly what happens to wealthy men who think they're above the law. The threat hung in the air between them, backed by the full weight of Marcus's experience and the evidence spread across the desk. Blackstone stared at the man who had once been his peer, trying to reconcile the arrogant billionaire he remembered with this calm, determined advocate sitting across from him. Fine, Blackstone said finally. I'll pay the girl her money. But this conversation never happened. This conversation happened, Marcus corrected, and it's being recorded with your consent under New York's one-party consent law. Sophia will have her check by Monday, or this recording, and all evidence will be forwarded to federal investigators. As Marcus stood to leave, Blackstone called after him. Marcus, what happened to you? You used to be one of us. Marcus paused at the door and looked back at the man who represented everything he used to be. I learned the difference between having power and deserving it. You should try it sometime. 2 hours later, Marcus sat with Sophia in the center's main room as she stared at the check in her hands. Not just her missing wages, but enough to cover her mother's medical treatment and her own living expenses for months. How did you do this? Sophia asked in wonder. Marcus smiled, thinking of Elena Rodriguez and the dignity she had shown in her darkest moment. I had a very good teacher once. She showed me that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. That evening, Marcus walked home through the streets of Queens, past bodegas and community centers, past families gathering for dinner and children playing in small parks. This wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he had earned through years of hard work and genuine transformation. He thought about Elena, probably preparing for another investigation that would change lives and expose injustice. He thought about Sophia, who could now afford her mother's treatment because someone had finally stood up for her dignity. And he thought about the strange journey that had brought him from a Manhattan penthouse to a Queens apartment, from exploiting the vulnerable to protecting them, from being someone who destroyed lives to someone who helped rebuild them. Marcus Wellington had found his redemption not in wealth or power, but in service to others. And for the first time in his life, he was truly proud of who he had become. The man who had once fired a woman for being beneath his standards now spent his days learning from people whose strength and dignity far exceeded anything he had ever possessed. It was, Marcus realized, exactly where he belonged. So, what did you think of the story of Elena Rodriguez and Marcus Wellington? Give the story a rating from 0 to 10. Thank you for watching.